Daniel Evans knew exactly what time it was when the wall clock in his basement froze. He'd walked through the door at 5:42 p.m. on October 14th, 1983, feeling the weight of the envelope in his pocket, collapsed onto the tattered lazy boy, and yanked the cord of the lamp so hard it knocked the clock to the floor. The glass shattered. The hand stopped. And time, as he'd known it for 32 years, came to an end. He didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he stared at the unfinished ceiling, at the exposed pipes that he'd been meaning to insulate for years now. 17 minutes before, he'd stood in a line of men, some crying, some cursing, some eerily silent, as they filed past tables where women in blouses handed out white envelopes. His foreman Joe Kowalski had placed a thick hand on his shoulder. "Nothing personal, Evans," he'd said, his voice low and gruff. "Numbers coming down from Pittsburgh. 25,000 across the board. 25,000. The number rattled in his head like loose bearings. 25,000 jobs gone, just like that. Almost the entire workforce of U.S. Steel and Gary. Not temporary layoffs. Permanent. Upstairs, Daniel heard the front door open, then close. The light footsteps of his daughter Angela, home from high school. "Dad," she called. "You home early?" He didn't answer. Couldn't find words yet. Through the thin floor, he heard her move toward the kitchen, heard the refrigerator door open and close. Then her footsteps on the stairs, hesitant. "Dad?" she said again, finding him in the dark basement. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" Daniel looked at his hands, calloused, stained with the permanent shadow of steel dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Hands that had fed his family. Hands that had built America. Hands that were now, apparently, obsolete. "They laid us off," he said, his voice flat as sheet metal. "All of us." Angela stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her backpack still slung over one shoulder. She was 16, too young to remember the smaller layoffs of the 70s, too young to understand how the steel mill had been as permanent in Daniel's mind as the lake or the sky. "But they can't," she said, as if it were a simple misunderstanding. That's Gary Steele. It's always been here." Daniel almost laughed, a bitter sound that caught in his throat. "U.S. Steel," he corrected automatically. "And no, it hasn't always been here. Nothing's always been here except the sand and the water." He paused. "And nothing's guaranteed to stay." The truth was, he'd seen it coming. They all had. Foreign steel flooding the market, cheaper than they could produce. New technologies requiring fewer men. The Vietnam-era building boom long over. But seeing it coming and believing it would happen were different things. Daniel Evans, like most men who'd worked the mill since graduating high school in 1951, believed in his bones that U.S. Steel was Gary, and Gary was U.S. Steel. The two couldn't exist without each other. He'd been wrong. "What are we going to do?" Angela asked, her voice small in the dim basement. Daniel reached out and switched on the lamp. "Same thing we always do," he said with false confidence. "We work. I'll find something else." But as he said it, he felt the lie burn in his throat. Men his age didn't just find something else. Not in Gary. Not now. The next morning, habit woke Daniel at 4:30 a.m. For 32 years, he'd risen at this hour, eaten the same breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, coffee, and driven the same route to the mill for the 6 a.m. shift. His body didn't know it was unemployed. He lay in bed beside Audrey, his wife of 28 years, watching the red numbers on the digital alarm clock. 4:31, 4:32. Time kept moving, even when everything else had stopped. Audrey stirred beside him. "Go back to sleep," she murmured. "You don't have to go in." But he did get up, put on his work pants out of habit, then realized his mistake and changed into jeans that felt foreign against his skin at this hour. Made coffee. Sat at the kitchen table as dawn slowly illuminated the yellow wallpaper, the collection of ceramic roosters Audrey had arranged on the windowsill, the stack of bills by the telephone. Through the window, he could see the orange glow in the sky, but it wasn't the sun. It was the eternal flame of the blast furnaces, burning day and night. Even from here, 3 miles from the mill, the furnaces defined the skyline, the air, the very color of existence in Gary. From the counter, the radio announcer's voice was somber. "Economists are calling it Black October as U.S. Steel announces the permanent elimination of 25,000 jobs in the Gary works." Mayor Richard Hatcher has called an emergency meeting with state officials to discuss the crisis. Union representatives demand. Daniel switched it off. He didn't need a radio to tell him what he already knew, that his life as he'd understood it was over. His mind returned to that summer day in 1951 when his father had driven him to the mill gates for his first shift. Evan's men have worked steel for 3 generations, his father had told him. It's honest work. It's how a man proves his worth. Daniel had nodded, believed him completely. That day, walking into the roaring heart of Gary Works, he'd felt the pride of joining something permanent, something bigger than himself. Now, staring at his coffee cup, those words haunted him. How a man proves his worth. What was he worth now? The phone rang at 7:15 a.m. It was Roy Dawkins, who'd worked the same shift for 20 years. Evans, Roy's voice was thick, as if he'd been drinking. You hear about Stancic? No, Daniel said, dread pooling in his stomach. What about him? He didn't take it well? Wife found him in the garage this morning. Engine running. Daniel closed his eyes. Jim Stancic, 53 years old. 2 kids in college. Jesus, Daniel whispered. Yeah, Roy said. Listen, some of us are meeting at Sonny's. Just to talk. You should come. Daniel said he would. After hanging up, he stood motionless in the kitchen, staring at the phone. He thought about Stancic's vacant eyes at yesterday's meeting, how he'd said nothing, just nodded mechanically when they handed him his envelope. Should someone have noticed? Should Daniel have checked on him? At Sonny's Bar and Grill, the mood was funeral-like despite the early hour. 20 men hunched over beers and coffee, speaking in low voices. These were men Daniel had known his entire working life. Men who'd pulled double shifts alongside him during the Vietnam production boom. Men who'd held him back when he nearly took a swing at a supervisor in '78 during contract negotiations. Men who knew exactly how hot the furnace ran, how the slag smelled when it hit water, how your ears rang for hours after a shift. So what's the plan? Daniel asked, sliding into the booth beside Roy and Pete Miller. Plan? Pete laughed bitterly. There is no plan. Town's dead. It's not dead, Roy said. We survived the '75 layoffs. We'll survive this. That was different, Pete countered. 4,000 jobs, not 25,000. And half those came back. This is a funeral. Daniel listened as they debated options. Retraining programs were mentioned, moving to other steel towns, taking minimum wage jobs just to have something. But underneath it all was a current of shame so powerful Daniel could almost taste it, metallic and bitter. None of them said it directly, but he understood. They believed the lie that their worth as men was measured by their labor, by the steel they produced. Now, with that identity stripped away, what remained? The days blurred together. Daniel applied for unemployment benefits, standing in lines with hundreds of other men who looked just like him, dazed, trying to maintain dignity while filling out forms that asked them to quantify their worth in hourly wages and years of experience. At home, he started projects he'd put off for years. Fixed the leaky faucet, painted Angela's bedroom, but each task, once completed, left him with more empty hours to fill. Audrey worked double shifts at the hospital where she was a nursing assistant. She'd always worked, but now her income was their only cushion against the abyss. Neither mentioned how her $7.25 an hour couldn't possibly replace his union wage, or how their savings would run dry by spring if he didn't find something. Anderson Tool and Die is hiring, she told him one evening, 3 weeks after the layoff. Mary's husband got on there. They're hiring kids, Daniel replied. 20-somethings they can train their way. Not men my age. You don't know that, she said, but her eyes told him she understood the truth. When December arrived, Gary seemed to physically darken. The mills, normally lit up day and night, now stood like silent monoliths against the winter sky. The streets grew quieter as people left. First the younger workers who could find jobs elsewhere, then entire families as houses went up for sale and schools began to empty. Daniel noticed how shopkeepers watched customers more suspiciously now, how conversations at the grocery store inevitably turned to who was leaving, who was staying, who had found work and who hadn't. Crime ticked up as desperation spread through the city like a virus. Christmas that year was sparse but carefully maintained. Audrey insisted on the usual decorations, the small tree in the corner of the living room, the lights along the porch railing. Angela, more perceptive than they gave her credit for, asked for nothing but received the leather jacket she'd mentioned months earlier. "You shouldn't have," she said, eyes wide as she unwrapped it. "We're fine," Daniel insisted. "This is temporary." But by February, with no job prospects and their savings dwindling, temporary had stretched into something that felt permanent. The unemployment office was now suggesting he look at jobs paying less than half his former wage. One counselor mentioned retraining for computer work, which struck Daniel as absurd. He was 49 years old. He'd worked with his hands his entire life. "Just try," Audrey urged when he told her about the computer classes. What's the harm in trying? The harm, he couldn't articulate, was in admitting that everything he'd built his life around was obsolete. That the skills he'd honed for 3 decades were now worthless. That he was worthless. Instead of answering, he grabbed his coat and walked out, driving aimlessly through the streets of Gary. He found himself near the mill gates, pulled over, and sat staring at the massive complex. Parts of it were still operational. U.S. Steel hadn't shut down completely, just gutted its workforce, and he watched a few men in hard hats entering for the evening shift. Men young enough to be his sons. Men who would earn half what he had, with fewer benefits and no job security. A security guard approached his car, suspicious. "Help you with something?" the man asked, eyeing Daniel. "Just looking," Daniel said. "I worked here 32 years. The guard's face softened slightly. "My old man, too. 28 years before they cut him in 75. He paused. "Can't stay here, though. Company property." Daniel nodded and started the car. As he pulled away, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the guard, at the mill, at the life he could no longer access. That night, he didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., he went down to the basement and began sorting through his tools. If he couldn't work at the mill, maybe he could work with his hands some other way. Carpentry, repair work, anything. Among the tools, he found a steel ingot, a small, polished cube of metal he'd kept as a souvenir from his first year at the mill. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight, its solidity. For decades, he'd believed steel was permanent, believed his role in creating it gave him permanence too. Now he understood how naive that belief had been. By April, Daniel had taken a job at an auto repair shop for $4.85 an hour, less than a third of his mill wage. The work was physically demanding in different ways. Crawling under cars strained his back, and the chemicals irritated his skin, but it was work. It was something. Yet each evening, driving home through Gary, he saw how the city was changing. Businesses were closing. Houses stood empty. The city, which had swelled to nearly 180,000 residents in its heyday, was hemorrhaging population. "Mandy's family is moving to Texas," Angela told them at dinner one night. Her dad got a job there. Daniel and Audrey exchanged glances. They'd discussed moving too, to Indianapolis, to Chicago, to anywhere with more opportunity. But Gary was the only home they'd ever known. Their parents were buried here. Their lives were rooted here. "Maybe we should consider it," Audrey said carefully after Angela had gone upstairs. "Starting fresh somewhere." Daniel stared at his hands, at the new calluses forming over the old. "And go where? Do what?" "I'm almost 50, Audrey. Who's going to hire me?" "People start over all the time," she insisted. "We could sell the house." "For what?" he interrupted. "Have you seen what houses are going for now? We'd be lucky to get half what we paid." They fell silent, the weight of reality settling between them. It wasn't just about jobs or money. It was about identity, about belonging to a place, to a way of life that was disappearing. By summer, the repair shop had cut Daniel's hours back to 3 days a week. More families on their block had moved away, leaving houses empty and untended. Downtown Gary, once vibrant with department stores and restaurants, was becoming a ghost town as businesses failed. In July, Audrey came home from her shift with news. The hospital was offering her a chance to train as a licensed practical nurse. The program would take a year, but afterward, her salary would nearly double. "I'd have to cut back to part-time during training," she said. "We'd be tight for a while, but then..." Daniel nodded, trying to mask the complex emotions churning inside him. Pride in his wife's opportunity. Shame that they needed it. Fear of the financial strain. And beneath it all, a sense that the world was inverting, that everything he believed about his role as provider, as head of household, was being challenged. "You should do it," he said finally. "It's a good opportunity." That night, he dreamed of the mill, of the furnace heart glowing orange, of the thunder of rolling steel, of men moving with purpose through steam and noise. He woke with tears on his face, embarrassed even in the privacy of darkness. By fall, Angela was talking about college, something neither Daniel nor Audrey had ever considered possible for themselves. She wanted to study business, maybe accounting. There's scholarships, she told them, spreading brochures across the kitchen table. And student loans. Daniel looked at his daughter, intelligent, ambitious, untethered to the beliefs that had limited him, and felt a complicated mix of pride and loss. She would leave Gary. She would build a life elsewhere. And in this, at least, there was hope. Winter came again, marking a full year since the layoffs. Gary had changed visibly. More boarded storefronts, more vacant lots, more desperation in the eyes of those who remained. The local paper ran a series called Gary After Steel, documenting the city's transformation. Daniel couldn't bring himself to read it. In December, Roy Dawkins stopped by unexpectedly. They sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee, catching up. Roy had found work at a warehouse in Hammond, commuting 40 minutes each way. Pete's gone to Arizona, Roy said. Jim Kowalski's drinking himself to death. Half the guys from our shift have scattered to the winds. Daniel nodded. And the other half? Roy shrugged. Making do. Like us. He paused. You ever think about what we were building all those years? All that steel. Where'd it all go? Daniel had thought about it. The steel had gone into skyscrapers in Chicago and New York, into bridges and highways across America, into cars and refrigerators, and the bones of a nation. They'd built things meant to last generations. We made something, Daniel said finally, even if it's all changed now. As Roy was leaving, he mentioned a community college program, older workers retraining for new industries. Free for displaced mill workers, he said. I signed up for the electrical course. Starts in January. Daniel nodded noncommittally. But after Roy left, he found himself thinking about it. Not computers, maybe, but electrical work. Something with his hands. Something with a future. That evening, he went to the basement and retrieved the small steel ingot from his toolbox. He set it on the mantel in the living room, next to the family photos. Audrey noticed, but said nothing. Later, when they were alone, she touched the ingot gently. What made you bring this up? Daniel considered the question. To remember, he said finally. Not just the work, but who I was then, who we all were. He paused. And to remind myself that things change. Steel rusts. Cities change. People adapt. Audrey leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Are we going to be okay? She asked, and he heard in her voice the same vulnerability he'd been carrying for a year. Not the same, he said honestly. But okay. Different, but okay. The next day, Daniel drove to the community college and picked up an application for the electrical certification program. As he was leaving, he passed a young man entering, early 20s, with the same determined look Daniel had worn 30 years earlier. Excuse me, the young man said, holding the door. Is this where they do the retraining thing? For the mill workers? Daniel nodded. It is. You worked at the mill. My dad did, the young man replied. 20 years. Now he's having a hard time. I thought maybe I'd get some information for him. Daniel studied him, the concern in his eyes, the way he stood straight, taking responsibility. Tell your dad, Daniel said carefully, that it's not about what you did before. It's about what you do next. The young man nodded, uncertain but listening. And tell him, Daniel continued, that what makes a man isn't the job. It's how he faces change. As Daniel walked to his car, he felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting or perhaps resettling. The Gary he had known was gone. The life he had planned was gone. But he was still here, still capable of learning, of adapting, of finding worth beyond what he produced. The steel ingot would stay on his mantle, a reminder of what had been built, what had been lost, and what remained after everything changed. Not just steel, not just a city, but the people who, like metal tempered in fire, emerged transformed.